In this example, we have code that will insert a new element into our baseball stats table, and we have a Lambda function that does that. So you'll see that we import the put item command. We're looking at the incoming event object, and that incoming event object has the new record. So there's a variable called new record, and that's grabbed from the event object. So it's looking for a new object called new item. It adds on the timestamp of when the record was created, and then it's using that as part of the parameters. So we have the new record here, and then we send the command, and then if it's successful, so we're looking for a status code of OK or 200, we return the new record. Otherwise, we're just catching an error message. Okay. If I look at the test configuration, our test event looks like this. So we have a new item. We have the new item is actually a new player record. So we have the team ID, the sort key, the player name, the position. So that's kind of the test of it. And then we'd be able to insert the record. And what I want to do is I want to connect this to API Gateway, and then I actually want to test this. And there's a couple of ways that we can test this. So I want to walk through some of those testing scenarios. Okay, so if I go over to API Gateway, what I want to do is I want to enable on our baseball stats API. So our baseball stats API right now consists of two HTTP methods, a get, which handles it's basically acting as a proxy to a scan command, and then our options, which will handle the cores operations for this API. But what I want to do is I want to create a new HTTP verb that's going to map to our put DynamoDB function, okay, which will create a new baseball stat item. Okay, because we are treating this as an insert, right? So we're going to insert a new record is the idea here with this code. Because we're doing an insert, that is going to map to the HTTP verb post. Okay, so when I come back over here, I'm at the root of my API. I'm going to create a new method. It's going to be an HTTP post. It's going to map to a Lambda function, and the Lambda function that I'm going to have it map to is this put DynamoDB Lambda function. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and create the method. Okay, so that's all set up. I do have to update my options, right? Because right now, if I look at my options with cores, it's set up so that it's going to have my cores headers, right? So it has these three response headers where it's allowing headers, the methods, the origin. And then if I look at the integration response, you'll see that it's defining the values of those header mappings. And there's two ways to do this. I could just come in and I could edit the default response. So instead of get and options being the only HTTP verbs supported, I could manually modify that so it's get, post, and options. Or I can come back to the root of the API and I can say enable cores, and then I can choose those HTTP verbs, and then it'll automatically be updated, right? So if I look at the integration response now, you'll notice that the post has been added to this list. Okay, so two ways to do it. Okay, and then once I've made those changes, I think I'm ready to deploy the API, and I'm going to deploy to the baseball stats stage, and the API looks ready to go. Okay, so in order to test this, there's a couple of ways to do it, but if I jump over to my HTML and JavaScript client, one way to handle this might be to say, I'm going to create a new file. In my new text file, I'm going to change the language mode, so it's HTML, and I'll say it's an HTML5 document. I could create an HTML form here. So I could say, here's a form with an action and a method and a submit button, all of those things. So my action would be my API URL, so this URL right here. Okay, so that's where I'm actually going to send my form data. I'm going to send it via an HTTP post. And then my form data, the way I'm going to handle it is I need a couple of things. So for instance, I'm going to need the team ID. I'm going to need the sort key. I'm going to need the player name. And then I'm also going to need the position. Okay, and I can fix the labels. So team ID, SK, player name, and position. And then I should probably fix the fact that this is for the team ID, this is for the sort key, this is for the player name, and this is for the position. I don't need an ID. The name is what's going to determine how I send data to the server. So the ID is not required in this case. So the IDs can all go. I probably don't want this type either. It's not really an email address, so I don't want any kind of email validation or any kind of form autofill. So the type is going to be text, so I probably need to put that there as well. All right, so I'm just building out this form. Okay, and I'm going to save this as new baseball stat.html. Okay, and if I want to go look at this, I have my client application up, so I think it was localhost 5500. Okay, and then I called it new baseball stat.html. Okay, so this is the form that we just created. The idea here is that I should be able to fill out this data, and I want it passed to my API. So I want it passed via a post. So I set up this form so that it's going to post all of my form data to this endpoint here, which is my API. Okay, so we should be able to see that. So if I open up the inspector and I look at my network traffic, I enter a new team ID. So let's say I call it player info underscore MLK for Milwaukee. And then the sort key, let's make it 99, and I'll put Jackson Churio in, and he plays right field. Or actually, he played left field kind of at the end of the season, so let's make him a left fielder. And then I'm going to go ahead and submit that, and we're going to watch the network traffic. So when I submit that, you can see that I sent it to baseball stats. And you'll notice that I get this error message: could not parse request.body into JSON, could not parse payload into JSON, unrecognized token, team ID. Okay, so if I look at the payload, you can see the form data has exactly what I was expecting, right? So it has the team ID, the sort key, the player name, and the position. Okay, so all of that is there. Okay, so setting up a form and posting the data is not necessarily how I want to submit my data. And part of that is the way the data is actually sent is in the form data. So it's not actually, like if I bring this tool up, you'll notice that there's the request methods a post, and it has part of this as payload, but really what I want to do is I want to put that data into the request body. Okay, so this isn't a great way to test it, and not to mention the fact that I don't really want to create an HTML page every time I want to test my API and I want to send data to my API, so it's kind of a pain in the butt. But if you remember back to this graphic from a previous video, when we send an HTTP post, we don't actually want to send our data via form data. We want to send data via the request body as JSON. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is there's a couple other tools that we might use, like a curl command, which I could do from a terminal window, or a better option that I like to use is a tool called Postman. So if I go out to the browser and I just search for Postman, okay, this is a tool, it's an API tool that allows me to test my API, and I can download it, and I'll have to create an account and things like that to sign in. I've already done that. So this is the tool and what it looks like. And what it allows me to do is it allows me to create a new HTTP request. Okay, so here's the HTTP verb that I'm going to choose. So I'm going to choose post as my verb. I don't know what I have in my, I didn't have the API URL in my clipboard. So I'll grab the API URL. Okay, so I'm going to post to that API URL. And then the other thing that I have to do is in the body, so this is the request body, I'm going to have raw data that is JSON, right? So it's JSON data. And then I can pass in the JSON data that I want to send. So for instance, I want to send the team ID having some value. I want to send the sort key having some value. I want to send the player name having a value, and I want the position having some value. Okay, so that's the data that I actually want to send. So the team ID will be player info underscore MLK for Milwaukee. The sort key 99, I know that's not Jackson Churio's number, but I don't know his actual number. And then I'm going to put them in left field again. Okay, so that's the data that I actually want to send. Okay, so I'm doing an HTTP post, and this is the request body data that's sent as JSON that I'm sending across. So the only thing I do is I select which HTTP verb, what URL, and then what data do I actually want to send, and then I'll get a response down below. So if I send this, you'll notice I get an error, a different error this time. Okay, not the same error that I was seeing over here, could not parse the request body into JSON. This error is a little bit different, saying it cannot set properties of undefined, setting created. Well, this error has to do with the fact that my Lambda code is trying to access this event.newItem. Okay, so right here. So it's trying to access this event.newItem. And then it's trying to set the created field. And what the error message is saying is new record doesn't actually exist because I got an undefined element from the event.newItem. So this new item doesn't exist on our event object. So we can't set the created timestamp on our new record. So then it fails, and we end up going down into this catch block, and we get an error message. Okay, so I'd like to be able to test this, but the reality is you'll notice I'm not getting this console.log because I'm not triggering the event from a test method. Right, so I have this console.log message right here on line 5. And you'll notice that I don't have any console.log messages where I've executed this code, but the code did get executed, and where I'm going to look is I'm going to look in CloudWatch to see what actually happened. So if I go to my monitor and I view the logs in CloudWatch, okay, so here's the latest and greatest. And you'll notice that it has info. So it has the fact that I passed in the team ID, the sort key, the player name, and the position. This is the event object. Okay, that's what's getting logged. So if I go back over and look at what's getting logged, I'm logging the event object. So the event object is the request body. Okay, but what I'm expecting is the event object to have a property called new item. Okay, and I don't have a new item. Okay, I only have the event object. I could change this, But more likely what I'm going to do, because a lot of times I want some metadata about the request, is I'm going to go back over to the API Gateway stage, or API Gateway API. I'm going to go to the resources. I'm going to look at this post. And what I want to do is in the integration request for my post, what I want to do is if I scroll down, there's this mapping template. And what I basically want to do is I want to pass that request through API Gateway to my Lambda function. Okay, so let's just go ahead and set that up. I'm going to go ahead and edit the integration request settings. And I'm going to scroll down to the mapping templates. I'm going to add a mapping template. So when the content type is application/JSON, then I'm going to go ahead and pass the request through to my Lambda function. Okay, so that's all I've done is I've changed that, and then I'm going to deploy it. And now I'm going to try to execute it again. So I'm going to jump over to Postman, and I'm going to send this request again. And you'll notice I get the same exact error. Okay, so same exact error, but then if I go over to CloudWatch, I should be able to refresh this, and I'll see something a little bit different. Maybe. That doesn't look any different. Okay. I wonder if I didn't get the latest and greatest version of this, so I just want to send the request again. I'm expecting to see the same error. Okay, so I'm still seeing the same exact thing, and I wonder if it's caching that data. Oh, finally it showed up down here at the bottom. You can see that I have this body JSON. So the body JSON contains the data that I've passed through, which is that new record, but then I'm also getting additional information about what's the path, what's the query string, what are the headers, what's the context, what's the request ID, the resource path. Okay, so all sorts of things like that. Well, I really don't want this to be called body-JSON, and I want to refer to this object right here. This is the one that I care about. But right now it's called body-JSON, and in my code I referred to it as event.newItem. So I could change it here. I could say I want this to be body-JSON, and I have to use square brackets because of the hyphen. I don't get to use the dot notation. This would work. Okay, so that is a change that I could make, but I don't want to change my Lambda code necessarily. Okay, so I want to leave it as such, where I have event.newItem. What instead I want to do is if I go back over to API Gateway, I go back to the resources, I look at that post, and I go to the integration request, and I specifically look at the mapping template. Right here is where they're calling that parameter body-JSON. Okay, and really what this input.json is doing is it's actually using the velocity templating language that comes from Apache. So you'd have to dig into the velocity template language, but essentially what it's doing is saying, give me the request body. That's what this input.json and then the $sign in quotes. So it's saying, give me the request body. I don't want to refer to it as body-JSON. My code is expecting it to be called new item. So I'm just going to go ahead and change this attribute name right here. And for some reason I'm not able to edit it. I want to edit it. So I don't want body-JSON, I want new item. Okay, and that's just to match up with what I had in my Lambda code. Okay, so now it's new item, and I'm going to go ahead and save it. And I'm going to deploy it. And now if I jump back over to Postman and I send the same request, Looks like I'm still getting that error message, and I'm not convinced that I should be getting the error message. Maybe I should, but my suspicion is that I'm just not accessing the latest and greatest version of the API yet. Okay, now it looks like it got refreshed, and now you'll notice that I'm getting confirmation of that record being inserted into my table. Okay, so now it looks like it was successful, and I was able to access that post request from my client application, which is Postman. I'm able to send that data through. I'm dealing with a mapping template, so I'm saying take the input that was passed to me, map it, and I do that in the integration request. I'm basically saying take that data and pass it through. I did make one modification, so I'm not calling it body-JSON. I can call it whatever I want. I'm calling it new item. And then I'm passing that through onto my Lambda function. My Lambda function receives everything as that event object, all the data that was passed through. But I don't care about all the data in this case. I only care about that new item. That's what's going to be my new record. And that's what gets inserted into my baseball stats table. Okay, and then I'm only returning that new record if the response from when I send the put item command, if the status code is OK or 200. So I have an HTTP status code of 200, meaning that it was OK, it was successfully inserted. Okay, so at this point, our API gateway is allowing us to pass data through. And we saw a couple of things here. First is we had to modify our options to enable cores for our new method request, which is a post. So we had to go into the options, and we had to say we're going to change this integration response so that the HTTP verbs that are allowed includes the post. So we did that. Secondarily, we first sent our data through with an HTML form, but then we realized that's not the correct approach. What we actually want to do is we want to send it through the request body, and the tool that we're using to do that is Postman. So Postman allows us to determine which type of HTTP verb against which URL, and then in the body we're able to pass JSON data through. And then once we're doing that from our client application, we then had to make a few changes to our post request. Specifically, we had to go into the integration request and say, hey, when we do send that data, we actually want it to get passed through to our Lambda function so that the Lambda function can use the data that was passed from the client in order to work with that data inside of our Lambda function. Okay, so we did a ton of stuff here in API Gateway just to enable that post request to then map directly to creating new baseball stats data records. Okay, so and then lastly, the last thing I didn't talk about was we used CloudWatch to kind of monitor what that incoming event looked like. Because in the past, when we'd test inside of this console, if we'd run the test and we had a test event, we could look at the console directly. But now, because our code is getting triggered as a result of an API gateway request, because of that, it's getting triggered. We're not the ones in charge of that. That's part of the AWS ecosystem. We don't have a console window that we can actually look at the logs. So instead, we had to go out to CloudWatch and look at those logs to verify what our event data actually look like. Okay, so all of those things happened as a result of API Gateway and trying to get all the integration pieces from our client to API Gateway to Lambda to DynamoDB all set up correctly and working properly.